right. Welcome to the top 5 ways to improve your Apple end user experience in Azure AD/Microsoft 365. I'm Mark Morzinski, and I'm here with Michael Upping. And something we try to do to be more inclusive of those with a visual impairment is just quickly describe what we look like. So I am a late 30s white male with medium length brown hair. I have glasses that have blue and black rims, and today I'm wearing a black shirt. Michael?
And I'm a mid-30s white male with short to medium brown hair, and I'm wearing a blue shirt.
Thanks. So, Michael and I are both product managers in the identity division at Microsoft. We work on Active Directory Federation Services, and Azure Active Directory. And we work with customers on their deployments of Azure Active Directory. And we take the learnings and feedback from those deployments and we work it back into the product to make it easier and better for everybody else. Now, some of the customers that Michael and I work with have a pretty large footprint, and we've been working with them to improve that end user experience. So, we wanted to take some of the learnings from those deployments and share this with the broader Mac admin community. Now, Michael and I are also in the Mac admin Slack. I know it's very popular. You may have seen us in there trying to answer some questions from time to time. So we tried to include some of the common questions we see there in this presentation as well. So let's go ahead and get started here. So first, we're going to cover what is Azure AD and Conditional Access. Then we're going to talk about why overprompting your users might not be the security benefit you think it is. But then we'll get into the real meat of this conversation, which are those top 5 recommendations. And then we'll close it up with a real quick list of go-dos, so you have that punch list that you can do when you go back to your environment. All right, so let's take a look at Azure AD. So if you have Office 365 or you have Azure, you have Azure AD. Now, Azure AD is not just an IDP for those two services. It's a full-blown identity access as a service solution, and we'll get to what that means here a little bit later in the presentation. Now, a trend we were seeing with a lot of our customers that was greatly accelerated by COVID was that users were working more and more from outside the office. They wanted to be able to work from the coffee shop, and the resources that they're accessing are no longer just on-prem resources. They're accessing cloud resources and SaaS apps, and the devices that they're using, they use their main corporate device for most of their work, but they want to be able to do work on their iPhones or their personal iPads. So as that started to kind of move in that direction, we've seen that that the network is the perimeter has really started to go away, and identity actually becomes that new perimeter. And if you've been to any Azure AD talks before, you may have heard us talk about this as identity as the control plane. So this is where Azure AD can come in. So let's talk about Azure AD, specifically around the protocols that Azure AD supports. So Azure AD is built on open standards. This means things like OAuth 2, OpenID Connect, SAML, and things like SCIM. And if you actually look at some of the Microsoft services themselves, they are actually built on using OpenID Connect. Now, we're continuing to invest in new services, things like the FIDO Alliance, as well as the Decentralized Identity Framework. And we have a whole team of people. If you're familiar with the identity standards, Pam Dingle leads that team. She's great. But they work with these different standards bodies to help define how the new standards and specs should work. So if you saw the new passkeys announcement from the FIDO Foundation, Tim on her team helped work on this. This is supported by Microsoft, Apple, and Google. And not only are they helping with new standards, they also make sure that Azure AD is compatible with these standards and that they'll work with Azure AD. So if you have any applications that support OAuth 2, OpenID Connect, or SAML, they should be very easy to integrate with Azure AD. And that means you can use things like conditional access. So conditional access is our zero trust authentication and authorization engine. If you're not familiar with it, as an admin, you can configure sets of conditions. And if the user device meets those conditions, they'll have to then pass controls that you set as an admin. And if they're able to pass those controls, then they get access to that resource. So a common question that we see in the Mac admin Slack is, when is conditional access being evaluated? They log in at first thing in the morning, and they get prompted for MFA, and then later in the day, they access that same application and they don't get prompted. Is conditional access even working? The answer is yes, conditional access is working. It is evaluated every time a user or device is trying to get access to a resource and is getting an access token. This kind of goes back to how those open standards like OpenID Connect and OAuth work. So it is working every time. It is evaluated every time a user or device goes to get access to a resource and gets an access token. Now, what are some of the things you can configure as an admin? So things like, where is the user coming from? Is there anything risky or suspicious about that sign-in? What is the state of the device? Is this a corporate device? Is this a mobile device? What are the application requirements you have? So you can actually have a conditional access policy that says that in order to get to Exchange Online from a mobile device, you have to use Outlook Mobile which prevents users from accidentally saving attachments to their personal OneDrive or their personal Dropbox. They have to save it to the corporate OneDrive or their corporate Dropbox. So let's take a look at how conditional access is actually evaluated, because this is another kind of common question we've seen there in the Mac admin Slack. So we've seen people ask that I have a conditional access policy, and if this one doesn't apply, then I want this second one to apply. And if the second one applies, then I want this third one to apply. And unfortunately, conditional access doesn't work like that. If you're familiar with how group policy objects work in Active Directory, where you have that local site domain OU precedence, it doesn't behave that way. All conditional access policies are ANDed together. And then the first question becomes, is there a conditional access policy in scope of the request? And if there is, the first control that always will win is a block control or deny control. So that is always satisfied first. If there is no block control, we then move into the grant controls, and they are applied in the following order of risk, MFA, device, and that approved client app protection. Now, something to keep in mind is that conditional access will always try to satisfy the policy without having the user do any interaction. So if you have a conditional access policy that says that you have to perform MFA or come from a compliant device, if the device is not compliant, they will then get prompted for MFA. So you can see here on the right, Michael logged into the Azure portal, and the is compliant attribute is set to false. That's what that red arrow was pointing to. So if Michael was signing in here, he would then have to be able to complete an MFA challenge response before he's granted access to the Azure portal. But if he was coming from a compliant device, he would not be prompted at all. He would be able to access that resource because he would be able to satisfy that policy. So as Mac admins, it's really important that we understand what are the conditional access policies in our environment, because it can greatly impact our end user experience. So let's take a look at some common policies we've seen with some of our customers. So first of all, requiring MFA for all users. This is a really good thing. We're glad to see people doing this. Blocking legacy authentication. This is things like POP3 or IMAP4, things that don't do modern authentication. Blocking access by country location. So people are saying, like, we don't have any users in this region. We don't have any business interests in this region. So we're not going to allow any sign-ins here. We're going to block anyone coming from this country. Starting to require users to come from a corporate device. So this could be compliant via an MDM, or this could be a hybrid join device from a Windows machine as well. And we're also starting to see the inverse of this, which is stricter controls if you're coming from non-corporate devices. So this is kind of like the grandma's workstation scenario that I hear a lot of security teams talk about, that someone's at their grandma's house for a holiday, and that's when they decide that they're going to get some like real good work done, and they're going to use grandma's workstation to do that. So for some reason, like, you should spend time with your family, but I get it. So we decide that we're going to set a sign-in frequency that says every 2 hours you have to re-sign in. So if you're not coming from a corporate device, you have to re-authenticate constantly. And this may be applying to your Mac OS environment, because even though they are corporate managed devices, if we haven't done the work to make sure Azure AD is aware of them, they may be getting caught by this stricter conditional access policy, and you probably have a really, really poor experience. If that is the case in your environment, we'll talk about how you can move those from being unmanaged to managed, but you're going to want to go talk to your IAM or security team to understand what those conditional access policies are, and be aware that they may tell you that this is good from a security perspective. They might say, we practice zero trust here. We don't trust anyone. We don't trust any user, any apps, any devices. We want people to be re-authenticating because this is good from a security perspective. This is proving who they are, who they say they are. So this is really good from a security perspective. Now, on the surface, from a security perspective, that sounds like that would be correct. But in reality, as we've seen with some customers, over prompting our users may not have that same security benefit that they think that they're getting. So let's talk about this. Why is prompting bad? So we found a couple of things online where we thought this was a really good example. This user here, Amy, said that, hey, just a PSA for everybody, don't blindly accept MFA requests if you're not trying to log into something, which is very good advice. And then someone responded to that saying that they knew of a company that every single morning their users' credentials are completely refreshed and their entire workforce gets a push notification to their phone, whether they've done anything or not. So that sounds just like absolutely terrible. And then here, Kay Reed had a suggestion, which was he wants to build an app that tracks how many hours per week that he spends 2FAing into different collaboration systems, which we thought was a very interesting idea. We have something that you might find kind of interesting here in a few slides. But let's talk about something we learned with one of our customers. So it's a customer case study. So one of our customers is in EMEA. They're a large financial institution. They had their red team doing a simulated cyber attack, a red team exercise. This is good stuff. And they decided to run through their playbooks. So they're going to do a password spray. This is where we take those easily guessable passwords. So right now, it's probably going to be summer 2022 exclamation point, or maybe even fall 22 exclamation point. So they tried it against all of their users, and they found some of the users that was their password. And they asked their leadership team, hey, can we just hammer these people with MFA prompts and just see what happens? Can we do this to them? The leadership team said, okay, you have approval to do this. Let me go talk to the help desk so that way they can tell the users this is what's happening when they call to see what's going on. And this is what they found. First of all, no users reported any unexpected prompts to their help desk during this hammering exercise. So that is off to a bad start. The second thing was many of the users just blindly approved the MFA request. So that's not good. And one user just uninstalled the Authenticator app entirely. I can't even deal with this thing. I got to get my work done. So they just deleted the app entirely from their phone, which is obviously not something we'd want people to do. So this is why prompting is bad. It can lead to compromise. You are teaching your users bad behaviors. You're teaching them to give up their credentials consistently throughout the day every time they see a login screen. And with MFA requests, if they're doing 4, 5, or 6 MFA requests a day, when the attacker guesses their password, it compromises that account, and they go to log in and they get that 8th or 9th request, they're just going to approve it because they approved the previous 5 or 6, 7 that day. So we don't really want to be prompting our users. It's bad from a security perspective. It's also really bad from a productivity perspective. This goes back to Kay Reed's tweet here. It ruins people's workflows. They have to have their phone near them. And this is especially bad on platforms when we're not doing any single sign-on to resources. And out of the box, there is no single sign-on for Azure AD on macOS. But Michael's going to talk about some of the things we can do to improve that here a little bit later. But really what we should be doing here is we should be striving to improve the user experience and security. So we only want to prompt our users when it's truly, truly needed. Things like when they're coming from a new device, they're coming from a location we've never seen them come from before. When the risk status of that user changes, that's when we want to prompt them. And when we do prompt them, we want to be having our users use passwordless credentials. This is the best experience. This will be less impactful on them when it is truly, truly needed. So that's what we want to start doing. Okay, so let's move on to the top 5 recommendations. The first recommendation is determine if you have a problem, and you want to show this with data. Unless you're an organization that has been working on this for some time, you probably have some room for improvement, and you want to show this with data. We actually have someone on our team. He used to work in Power BI, and he has a shirt that he likes to wear that says, "In God we trust, all others bring data." And all of the data you need is in the Azure AD sign-in logs. And you can see all this. We have a pre-built workbook. And if you go to ak.ms/MFA prompts workbook, this is in the Azure Monitor part. So if you're not sending your Azure AD sign-in logs to Azure Monitor and Log Analytics, that's okay. Go take a look at this because all of the logic and queries are in here. You can click edit, you can see those, and then you can go ahead and rewrite those queries and wherever you are sending your Azure AD sign-in logs to. So if that's Splunk or QRadar, Sumo Logic, or Kibana, it doesn't really matter. Take a look at this. Now, what is some of the stuff that we have in here? We have some pre-built visuals, things like which users are being prompted the most in your environment. And this can be a very eye-opening experience for some customers. It will also show you what is the average amount of prompts per user. It will show you which applications have the highest prompt count. We've had customers find out that some of their applications are misconfigured and they're over-prompting users when they don't really need to. And then finally, what is that device state of these prompts? So here you can see that 95% of the prompts in this workbook here are coming from unmanaged devices. So these are devices that the Azure AD does not know about. They may be falling to those stricter conditional access policies. So we really want to take a look at this and see how we can move these devices from unmanaged to managed. And this is what Michael's going to talk about next here in our second recommendation.
All right, so the second recommendation is enroll your Max and MDM, and if you can, start to use device compliance. There's actually a couple reasons that we want MDM in our environment. One is because MDM is the only modern way to deploy SSO features to macOS, as well as iOS. Another reason is because MDM helps us improve device and identity security using conditional access. So we have a couple different features that we really need that MDM experience for, or that MDM management plane for. So again, SSO is a big part, and security is also a big part. So we can lower the number of prompts that our users are seeing through the deployment of SSO, which typically requires MDM in order to do it correctly in the modern way. And we can also improve security by driving down that overprompting and not training our users to make bad decisions. These are related but different features, and this is a point I really want to hammer home. If you just want to deploy the SSO piece and you don't want to integrate your devices with Azure AD for device compliance, you can do that. You can deploy just the SSO pieces. If you want to deploy just the device compliance piece and you don't care about SSO, you can do that. They are related features, but they are slightly different. The main thing I want you to take away from this is that they both require MDM. So if you're one of those organizations that is still managing Macs through non-MDM methods, the time is now to start thinking about how are we going to start moving towards MDM. All of these features are starting to require MDM. So for us on the Azure AD side, it's really, really easy to integrate with Azure AD for things like device compliance if you're using Intune as your MDM. Intune just has native hooks into Azure AD. The two products know about each other, so it's very simple. And I'll get into what the configuration for that looks like in a little bit. However, if you're using a non-Intune MDM, we do have integrations with third parties as well. So it's really common for our customers to be using Jamf Pro. I know there's probably a lot of people here who are using Jamf Pro. So we do have integration points there where Jamf Pro can feed compliance information into Intune and therefore into Azure AD. We have other customers who are using things like VMware Workspace ONE or other third-party products that we can hook into. So if you're using a non-Intune MDM, you should still be looking towards integrating with Intune and Azure AD so that we can improve that device security story. But again, just to reiterate, if you are not using an MDM and that MDM is not integrated into Azure AD, we're going to see all of your Macs as unmanaged. So if your identity team is setting up conditional access policies that are really aggressive towards unmanaged devices, your Mac users are likely going to have a bad user experience. So again, a good macOS user experience and a good security stance on macOS requires two MDM delivered capabilities. The device health attestation, so that in our conditional access policies, we can determine is a device managed or unmanaged, and is it healthy or unhealthy? And then SSO deployed through MDM so that we can reduce those prompts. Just to illustrate what this looks like with Intune integration, you can see here that we have a device on the left-hand side that's managed by Intune MDM, and that information is fed to the Intune Cloud Service. So the device talks to the Intune Cloud Service, and then the Intune Cloud Service makes a call over to Azure AD and sets a flag on the device object in Azure AD's database saying whether or not that device is compliant or not. And any unmanaged devices are automatically going to show as not being managed. So in that screenshot Mark showed earlier with the sign-in log information where the device wasn't managed, that was a device that was just completely non-existent. If you have a different MDM, the path is very similar, and I want to be really clear about how this works. So if you're using Jamf Pro, VMware AirWatch, these other MDMs, they still talk to the Intune Cloud Service. The Intune Cloud Service is the thing that knows how to talk to Azure AD. So if those devices are being managed by your other MDM, you want to stitch together that MDM and the Intune Cloud Service so that that compliance state can get fed all the way through to Azure AD. This may be a little bit of extra work, but generally we think it's worth it so that you can get some of the benefits that we've been describing. All right, recommendation number 3 is set up your SSO infrastructure. Like we said, SSO is really, really critical to a good macOS user experience as well as good device security. So I want to step back and talk about different forms of SSO on macOS because I find that there's a lot of confusion around what's the right approach for an organization to take. So for a lot of organizations, they started out with doing Kerberos SSO to an LDAP directory. So this commonly would be on-premise Active Directory. Apple has been telling customers to actively move away from this. There's other ways to achieve Kerberos SSO, but this is fundamentally for on-premise resources. So if you have on-premise web servers that are using IIS, on-premise file shares, on-premise print servers, this is really legacy on-premise integrations. There's a more modern way to do SSO natively in macOS and iOS, and that's using Apple's Kerberos SSO extension. This more modern method for doing Kerberos SSO that Apple is providing must be deployed through the MDM channel. There's no other way to sideload this. It has to be deployed through MDM. This is Apple's recommendation for doing Kerberos SSO these days, but I want to be clear that this is still primarily for on-premise resources, so on-premise Active Directory or other LDAP systems. So it's not really designed for the cloud. A couple of years ago, Apple did provide us with a different way of doing SSO natively with the cloud, and that is around modern authentication, which I'll talk about in a moment, for IDP vendors. So in our case, we're an IDP vendor. We make Azure AD. So we created a vendor-provided plugin that sits on top of Apple's extensible enterprise SSO framework. Very similarly to the Kerberos SSO option, this must be deployed through the MDM channel, and I'll get into why that is. Apple actually provides two different ways of doing this. So one is the credential method, and then the other is the redirect method. Azure AD's implementation is the redirect method, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means and how you actually deploy this. This is not the full list of ways to do SSO on macOS. Obviously, Jamf Connect exists that can do some similar things, but for the most part, any option that is not this modern auth IDP vendor provided option is going to be using Kerberos and is stuck providing SSO to legacy systems. So let's look again at Kerberos and understand a little bit more deeply how this works and why we have some legacy issues with it and how we can improve. So if you need to do Kerberos, which a lot of organizations still need, you should probably use something like Jamf Connect or Apple's modern Kerberos SSO extension. Again, we want to move away from binding to LDAP directories. It's not the modern recommendation anymore. So regardless of which way you're implementing Kerberos, it really could be any of the options. The way that it fundamentally works is that the user provides their username and password to the device. So this might be at the lock screen, or it might be once they hit the desktop of the device and they get a pop-up window. But for the most part, this is the way to authenticate to on-premise Active Directory is username and password, and that's about it. Not really a lot of support for other credentials. The device sends those credentials to Active Directory and asks for what's called a Kerberos ticket granting ticket. So this is just a standard thing that Active Directory can hand out to devices once it validates the user's credentials. So if the credentials are valid, the device will possess that TGT. Then when the user wants to access their application, like it might be a file share or an IIS website or some other Kerberos integrated resource, the web application or the file server, whatever it is, says, I need a Kerberos ticket that is specific to me in order to give you access. So the user then talks to Active Directory with their TGT. So the TGT is sent to Active Directory by their Mac. The Active Directory domain controller validates that TGT and returns what's called a a TGS to the device. This TGS is specific to the application. So the TGT is general to the device. The TGS is specific to the app. The device then sends the TGS to the application. So this could be done in their browser if they're using Safari or Chrome or Edge, or if they're using a desktop application of some sort. But the TGS is passed to the app and the user successfully gets access to that application. So this is SSO because the user only signs in once. They're prompted either at the Mac login screen or once they hit the desktop, they sign in one time to get that TGT. And then going forward, any Kerberos access is provided silently by the Mac using that TGT to go get these TGSs. So the user only has to provide credentials a single time. So it's good for the end user experience and it's good for security because we're not prompting the user constantly and making their life bad. Just to illustrate what this looks like on a Mac, if you run the klist command in terminal, you can see here on a Mac where I'm doing this, I have a Kerb TGT. So this is the TGT that's specific to my user on this device. And then in the second row, you can see CIFS and then the name of a server. This is just a file share on my domain controller. And this is the TGS that is specific to that implementation or to that application. So let's talk about where the issues are here. Why is this not good for the cloud? So this really is not built for the internet. It's generally not a good idea to have your Active Directory environment and your domain controllers exposed to the internet, and it's very uncommon for that to be the case. A lot of times, we don't necessarily want users going over a VPN for access to every resource. It's not a very modern zero trust approach. And a lot of our applications are moving outside of the corporate perimeter. We have things like SaaS applications, third-party services, things that are outside the general enterprise firewall. Things are moving towards the cloud. And a lot of these SaaS applications do not use Kerberos, so we need a different way of signing into them. So Kerberos doesn't make sense. The device should not be able to find a domain controller generally. The application really is not going to trust your on-premise domain. So if we were to try to use Kerberos for a SaaS application, just as before, the user might provide their username and password. And at that point, what should the device do? Should it try to find a domain controller to get its TGT? It just doesn't really make sense. We need a different, more web and modern auth compliant way to do SSO for these cloud resources and these more modern resources. So again, this really is not going to work at all without a VPN in the picture. So the first thing that we need to do here is we need to modernize with modern auth. And what I mean by modern auth are more modern protocols like SAML, which is good, and OpenID Connect, which is even better. And we'll get into how some of the tokens are handled for these and why these are so good for these modern web applications. One of the key advantages of modern auth is that it's web-based. So this gives us a lot more flexibility in things that we can do. Like we can challenge for certificates. We can provide different forms of MFA. So for example, Azure AD supports FIDO keys, Windows Hello for Business if you're on a Windows device, authenticator apps, smart cards, SMS, phone, et cetera, et cetera. We can do things to the user's session when they access the application, like direct them through a proxy service. And there's many, many more pieces of functionality that are being built into Azure AD and Conditional Access. So in general, as we start to use these SaaS applications, or even we're developing our own internal applications, we want to move towards modern authentication, SAML, OpenID Connect, or other ways of integrating. This is really critical for doing modern SSO and providing modern security for our applications and our end users. So let's talk briefly about how this SSO functionality actually works. So one of our goals here is that we want to prompt end users once per user, per device, per password change. If it's the same user on the same device and something hasn't changed, like they haven't changed their password, their risk hasn't changed, the device hasn't been disabled, the user hasn't been disabled, there's really not a good reason to prompt them. So we need to have some sort of artifact that's on the device that provides us with SSO that we can revoke if something does change, but otherwise, if nothing's changed, we can continue to provide that user with access. So in Azure AD, what we typically use for this is a thing called a primary refresh token. So this is a long-term authentication token that is possessed by an SSO broker on Windows, Mac, iOS, Android, other operating systems. So this is a artifact that you can get, and it's valid for 14 days, but it's an actively rolling window. So generally, as long as the user is using the Mac, that PRT is going to be continually refreshed and continue to be valid until it's revoked or something has changed. So it's a good tool for us to use to provide that user with ongoing access until something changes that requires us to intervene and then start to prompt the user for MFA or block their access. The PRT is then used by applications to acquire app-specific refresh tokens and access tokens, similar to that TGT and TGS relationship that I showed earlier. So I might use an application that knows how to talk to the broker on my Mac or my iPhone, and that application will ask the broker to get a refresh token access token pair for my application. So if I say open Outlook on my Mac, it can go talk to the broker, and what it's going to get is this refresh token and access token. So the refresh token provides long-term access to the application. So this is basically valid until revoked, or again, until there's an event that requires us to intervene. So every time the user tries to access the application, they might provide the refresh token saying, I already did MFA, or I already satisfied other controls. Azure AD evaluates conditional access every single time, just like before. And if nothing's changed, then we hand out a new access token. The access tokens are what the client actually passes to the application in order to get access. It's what the application wants to see. These are very short-lived because, again, we need the ability to revoke that access if something does change. So about once an hour, every application will ask for new access tokens. So these are much more short-lived, but every single time we ask for an access token, so on an hourly basis, conditional access is being reevaluated. It's just that most of the time we don't need to interrupt the user to get them to sign back in. So let's see how we can get a PRT on a Mac. So before I go into the actual flows, there's a couple prerequisites that you need in order to make this modern auth SSO method work on macOS. So one is you need an IDP that supports modern auth protocols, relatively self-explanatory. In our case, that's Azure AD. There's other ones out on the market though, but we're going to talk specifically about our implementation. You need to integrate your apps with that IDP, and Mark's going to talk about this in a little bit. Again, that IDP vendor must create an SSO extension plugin. So Apple provides the underlying framework in the operating system, but your IDP vendor needs to go create something that can sit on top of that framework. So we've done that for macOS and Azure AD. And then you have to have Max under MDM management. So again, it's super critical that we start to modernize our approach to managing Macs and get them into our MDM. All right. So the modern approach here is to use a modern auth IDP and tokens. And so on a Mac, this means that we have to have a SSO extension that can use that PRT and provide those other tokens on behalf of applications. So for us, we built our SSO extension plugin into the Microsoft Company Portal app. So a lot of people are familiar with this app because it's what you use to enroll into Intune. But again, if you don't use Intune as your MDM, you don't necessarily need to leverage this application for that functionality. There is an SSO extension capability within it, and you could use just that piece if you so choose. So just like in our Kerberos example, the user needs to authenticate to the SSO extension. We have an SSO extension window that can be provided where the user does this authentication. It can either be done within the company portal app, or they can use another app like Safari. I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. Azure AD, by virtue of using modern auth in the web, can do many more forms of authentication. So rather than just username and password, we can do things like passwordless authentication using the Microsoft Authenticator app, or username plus password plus various forms of MFA. So the user provides their credentials, and then the SSO extension goes to Azure AD and acquires a PRT. We then store that PRT locally on the device. We just use standard methods in the operating system to protect it, so it's written into the keychain, just standard macOS security. So at this point, our broker has the PRT. Again, that PRT is good for a rolling 14-day window. So as long as the user is using the Mac every 14 days, this is very likely going to be updated. So there's one more caveat, and that's that there's actually two different flows for applications to integrate with the broker. So we're going to start with what we call the MSAL flow. MSAL is just a short form for saying Microsoft Authentication Library. This is an auth library that we provide that makes it easy to integrate your applications with Azure AD. So if you're building your own web applications, your own desktop applications, your own mobile applications, I'd highly recommend you take a look at MSAL, because MSAL natively knows how to talk to our brokers. So at this point, the application that uses the MSAL library talks directly to the broker. It's aware that a broker might exist. It then asks the broker to get access tokens for it because it wants to access an application. So I might open Outlook and it says, I want access tokens for Exchange Online. The SSO extension uses its PRT to ask Azure AD for those access tokens. Conditional access is evaluated, and if everything is good, Azure AD returns those app-specific tokens. The SSO extension gives the tokens to the client application, and the user gets access to their resource. So my Outlook client connects to my mailbox and Exchange Online. However, we also have applications that don't use the MSAL library that we might want SSO for. It's things like Safari, the Jamf self-service portal, other applications like VPNs, you name it. There's other things that we might want to do SSO with. So this is where Apple's special sauce at the operating system level really comes into play. And so we call this the redirect flow. So here I might open Safari and try to log into my application, and my app says you need to go get a token. So that app would try to go to Azure AD's URL. It's being redirected to login.microsoftonline.com. And here, the macOS network stack actually intervenes. So if we've configured our MDM profile for this correctly, the network stack on the Mac will redirect that traffic to the broker. So the broker knows that traffic for login.microsoftonline.com should be handled using the broker and using the PRT. So the SSO extension then, just like before, uses its PRT to go request a token. If everything checks out, the token is returned, and then it is passed back to that application. So this allows us to do SSO with apps that do not use Microsoft's auth libraries on macOS and iOS. So this is a really good reason to deploy our modern auth SSO extension, because you can get SSO in non-Microsoft applications on your Mac. So this is really easy to deploy if you use Intune. We pre-built a lot of the configuration for you. I have an aka.ms link there if you want to go look at our Intune-specific configuration guide. But mostly for Intune, you just need to configure that you want the SSO app extension type to say Microsoft Azure AD, and then there's a few keys that you can configure there down at the bottom. If you're a Jamf Pro customer, there's a little bit of extra work that you need to do. So you need to configure some information about the broker in the MDM profile. So that would be configuring things like the extension identifier, the bundle ID of the application. You specify that this is a redirect type SSO extension. And then you actually configure the list of URLs that you're going to redirect at the operating system level. This is why this has to be deployed via an MDM, because you're essentially telling the Mac to redirect or intercept network traffic. And this is a very dangerous capability. So it really needs to be pushed through an administrative function. So this is why we have an MDM requirement. And then finally, instead of configuring the keys in a UX, for Jamf, you have to upload a plist file. And so if you go to the doc at aka.ms /Apple SSO-Jamf Pro, we do have a Jamf Pro specific configuration guide where you can get our recommended plist file and get a list of all these other settings. Now, if you follow our recommended configuration, you can actually have it so that users do not need to open the company portal application. So again, if you use a different MDM and you don't really need them to open the company portal app, you can configure it so that our SSO extension provisioning window will open in other applications. So you can see here that I have Safari open, and when I tried to log into portal.office.com in Safari, this little web pop-up appeared over my Safari window, and this is actually provided by the SSO extension. So the user here can do passwordless sign-in or username plus password plus MFA, and then get access to their application. And this will provision the SSO extension. But the requirement here is that company portal must be installed on the device. So that's always going to be a requirement. Again, you don't need to use Intune as your MDM. You don't need to do the conditional access integration. We just recommend it. We think it's a good idea. If you're testing, I do think that the easiest tool for doing testing with is actually Safari in private browsing mode, which is why you see this in the screenshot here. SSO should still work in private browsing mode in Safari. So if you're deploying your profile for the first time, try using Safari in private browsing mode. It's the easiest way to test. Okay, a couple caveats to call out. So one is that Microsoft's part of this equation, so our broker, is still technically in public preview. Public previews from Azure AD are supported, but we still reserve the right to make changes to them. So this is a supported piece of functionality, but you will see the preview tag on it. Applications that you want to integrate with the broker must use the Microsoft Auth library, so that MCell library, or Apple's system web frameworks. If you have applications that don't fit into either of these two buckets, they will be unaware of the SSO extension and it will be unaware of them, and therefore we will not be able to provide them with SSO today. So the main culprits here are Chrome and Firefox. They don't use Apple's native web frameworks. They don't have MCell built into them, so they are unaware of the broker. Talk to your app vendors about the need to support SSO extensions. Apple is really emphasizing these as time goes on. So generally, any vendor on macOS should want to integrate with SSO extensions and work with this framework. So if you have other applications that don't work, talk to your vendors about starting to support this SSO framework. Those plist files are a little bit hard to manage, so we may change the default settings in our SSO extension to be a little more mistake-friendly, because one thing I've found is that people will sometimes make mistakes in the plist file, and it will break the SSO functionality. So be really careful about making edits to those plist files. The functionality is a little bit brittle today. And finally, there's no support for using FIDO keys as an auth method in the SSO extension provisioning window. So the recommended passwordless method is to use the Microsoft Phone sign-in passwordless method, which Mark will talk about a little bit more in a minute. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Mark to talk about recommendation number 4.
All right. Thanks, Michael. So our fourth recommendation is to use the Authenticator app and start moving our users to passwordless. So just as Michael talked about how the company portal acts as that token broker for Mac OS, the Authenticator app on iOS and iPadOS devices does the same thing. It provides that PRT experience. So you will have less prompts just by having the Authenticator app on those devices. Now, if you're a company that's maybe rolled out MFA several years ago and we didn't really enforce what methods they could use, so a phone call or text is fine, and now we want to start moving them to the Authenticator app. If you go to aka.ms/nudge, you can configure a setting that when the user signs in, they will then have to go through the Authenticator app registration experience. Now, another thing we want to see people do with the Authenticator app is if you allow push notifications, so that's what you see there on the upper left where they get the MFA prompt and they just have to click approve or deny. We want to see you turn on a new feature, which is called number match. And this is where you can see in the lower right-hand screen there that they get a number on the screen and they actually have to type that into the Authenticator app to complete that challenge response. So this is a really big deal when it comes to the MFA hammering technique I talked about earlier. So we want to make sure we're turning on number match as possible. And that's another good thing to turn on because this is how passwordless method is going to work for the Authenticator app. So let's go ahead and talk about passwordless. Now, in the past, when we talk about passwordless with a lot of our customers, their first reaction is to say they can't do passwordless authentication because they have a mainframe or these LDAP apps or something like that, so they can't just turn off passwords overnight. And we totally agree. You cannot do that. But we should be trying to get to be using passwords less. This is our best user experience combined with our best security. And Michael and I have actually been passwordless with our corporate Microsoft IT Macs, as well as using the corporate Microsoft IT resources since November 2020. Right around Thanksgiving, MSIT went in, they put a random password on our accounts, and we have not had to use a password since then. And you can use passwordless credentials on any of the applications that you have integrated with Azure AD. So as Michael kind of talked about, is the Kerberos stuff is for those legacy applications. You may find that most of your users are using these modern authentication applications, and they can actually start getting to passwordless right now, especially if they're not using those legacy authentications. Now, what are some of the methods you can use from passwordless? Authenticator app with number match works great. You can also use FIDO2 keys. So if you see there on the right there where you click sign in with Windows Hello, which is our third method, that's for Windows devices, or security key, you click that. You will then get prompted to insert that FIDO key into the Mac. And then you have to do some sort of proof of presence there. So that could be just physically touching the key. If the key supports biometrics, you can use that there. And this works with Edge and Chrome today. This will work with Safari in the future. And another passwordless method that's kind of emerging here, this is that passkeys. This is going to be supported by Apple, Microsoft, and Google. And that passkey is going to be synced across devices on the same platform. This is a very exciting thing that you should keep an eye on. Okay, our fifth recommendation is you want to single sign on all of the things. All of the hard work we did in steps 1 through 4 won't matter if your apps aren't integrated with your IDP. And we see, and Michael kind of talked about this a little bit, we see this in the Mac admin Slack. We see, hey, I've got single sign on for my Office 365 apps and Workday. How do I get my VPN to do this? How do I get this other app to get single sign on? That is exactly the questions you should be asking. So what apps can you integrate with Azure AD to start getting that single sign on experience? First, anything that supports modern authentication, things like SAML, OAuth 2, or OpenID Connect. If you do have some of those on-prem legacy Kerberos applications, we can use something called Azure AD App Proxy, which I'll talk about that here in a minute. And if you have some of those password-based, like password stuffing things, you can use those as well with Azure AD, but we really recommend moving to a more modern authentication, as well as anything that's integrated with like F5 or Akamai. We have ways to do integration with that. And this is going to be a journey. Microsoft IT has moved almost 18,000 applications from their internal ADFS to Azure Active Directory. So start working with your IAM team. And if you have applications like that, start moving them to Azure AD. You can start getting that single sign-on benefit as soon as you can. And we try to make this easy for you. We have an Azure AD application gallery. We have over 3,000 apps integrated in that, and we're continuing to add more frequently. If you see applications that are not in the Azure AD application gallery, there's a form you can fill out, and we are happy to work with you and the application vendor to get them integrated into the gallery, because then it works for everybody. Now, earlier I talked about how Azure AD is an identity as a service provider. It's more than just single sign-on to Office 365. We're continuing to release lots of new features all the time. When you start migrating your apps into Azure AD, you can start to benefit from additional scenarios. And some of the things we've seen our customers work with here is when the HR app is provisioning the user, we use things like dynamic groups. So we put the user in a dynamic group because they're in the sales org, so they automatically get access to Salesforce. And because they're in Azure AD, we can automatically provision that user to Salesforce. And when they fall out of that group, we can automatically deprovision that user from Salesforce. So we can do lots of things like that. We have things around governance where we can say, this is the entitlements that you get as a birthright. We can have access reviews where we can delegate to the business to say, these are the users that have access to this application. These are the users that we're paying licenses for. Should all these people have access to this resource? And the business owner can say, no, let's remove these 2, 3, 8 people, and it can automatically get removed from that access. So there's lots and lots of stuff you can do here. This is the traditional identity and access management stuff. So as you move your apps that your Mac users are using to Azure AD to get that single sign-on benefit, talk to your IAM team, because you might have a bunch of things like this you can do as well to improve that experience. All right, last thing here, let's talk about Azure AD App Proxy. Azure AD App Proxy is a reverse proxy on ports 80 and 443. You have no need to do a VPN. So the applications that you can use with App Proxy, things that are claims aware that are on-prem web apps that you haven't moved yet, but also if you have on-prem Kerberos web applications that maybe you're doing integrated Windows Auth with, like SharePoint or something like that, you can actually move those with Azure AD App Proxy, and you'll get single sign-on to those resources as well. Our goal is to use single sign-on as much as possible. And the other benefit here is any of those conditional access policies that you've made will also apply to Azure AD Application Proxy. So again, you don't need a VPN. It's outbound only, ports 80 and 443. Take a look at this if you have those legacy applications that you haven't been able to modernize yet. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Michael to close out here with some list of go-dos.
Okay, let's talk about the go-dos. So number one, again, is work with your identity and access management and security teams. If you're on the device management team, you may need to go to talk to others in your organization. Figure out, do we have issues in the end user experience? Are we seeing our Macs as unmanaged devices? Are there improvements that you can make? And then show it with data. Use those pre-built Azure AD authentication prompt analysis workbooks that we provide. Number two is get your devices managed by an MDM, and if possible, set the device compliance via Intune or integration with a third-party MDM. So really set the stage for building on top of the MDM platform, and if possible, get those devices into Azure AD so we can identify them as managed or not. Number three is deploy SSO. So we would prefer that it's the Azure AD Enterprise SSO plugin. You could deploy this for macOS and iOS. If you're using Kerberos still, deploy some method of doing Kerberos SSO like Apple's built-in Kerberos SSO extension. Again, deploy both of these through MDM. Number four is nudge those end users to register for MFA for things like Microsoft Authenticator and start moving towards passwordless. The Authenticator app provides a great way of doing passwordless on macOS, so start pushing users in that direction to give them the best user experience and the best security. And then number five is more SSO. Get your applications integrated into your IDP, move your apps into Azure AD, start moving away from apps that require line of sight to a domain controller. Get your applications integrated into that IDP so that all the work you did in numbers 1 through 4 benefits you in the biggest way possible. And with that, thank you for your time today.